So Paul claims to be, his words here, an ambassador in chains, are an oxymoron, or even a paradox. Paul claims to be an ambassador, but he also states that he is in chains. The very nature of being an ambassador signifies one who is granted outward splendor and high honor. This was and continues to be a law of nations. A violation of this honor could then, as now, spark immense outrage and even war. If you're an ambassador, you're supposed to be given the credentials of an ambassador to the people that you are dealing with, and they are supposed to treat the ambassador properly. Okay? If we were to take the ambassador, remember when Japan declared war on the United States, and they first bombed Pearl Harbor, and then later they came in and they said, we've declared war on you. Okay, so and the timing was just kind of suspect. Did they come in late or whatever? Okay, but it happened that way. If it was anybody else, what would they have done? They would have taken those people and they would have arrested them, and they would have, instead, they excused them and told them to go back to your country. Okay, because an ambassador is not to be put in chains. That's the point. It's an oxymoron to say I'm an ambassador in chains. Okay, we didn't arrest the Japanese ambassador. We said, get out of here. Okay, violation of this honor could then, as now, spark immense outrage and even war. An ambassador represents a leader. Thus, Paul was a representative of Christ, and yet he was bound as if a criminal. The word for ambassador here is presbeuo. It means to act as an established statesman or a diplomat, a trusted, respected ambassador who is authorized to speak as God's emissary, meaning to represent his kingdom. That's Helps Word Studies definition, and I always love when they take a word, if it's translated as ambassador, and then they put it in the definition. That's not the way that you define words. In other words, sometimes people will say, well, this is an ambassador, and then they explain what an ambassador is by saying he's an ambassador. Doesn't work. You need to not use the same word in the explanation as you do in what you're explaining. Anyway, it is found only here and in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where it says, we'll take you there, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and it says in verse 20, now then we are ambassadors for Christ, as though God were pleading through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God, for he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. That is what their duty as apostles were. They were ambassadors of Jesus Christ. Okay? The ambassador of Christ, who represented the one who knew no sin, but who was made to be sin for us, was also accounted as the one who had committed an offense. Paul emulated his Lord well in order to bring the word to the world. Even today, he is despised by the Jews. If you want to talk to somebody that knows who Paul is, and you want to talk to them about theology, they'll say, I don't want to hear about Paul. They don't want to hear anything about it. Now you might get them to listen to the Gospels because they know Jesus is a Jew, and they might say, he was a heretical Jew, but they might listen to it. I don't know. But they don't know that Paul was a Jew. Most Jews don't realize that. They think that Peter and Paul were non-Jews. They'll say, he was a Christian. Well, yeah, he was a Christian, but he was also a Jew. Most Jews that you hear come to Christ are fully surprised when they start reading the New Testament and they say, this is a Jewish book. All the guys that are writing it are Jews. They're completely taken aback by it because they don't realize that that is the case.
Except for Luke.
Yeah, well, Luke is not a Jew. That's correct. He was a chronicler, and he was a Gentile. He was a Gentile doctor. I'm not going to go there because I brought it up in a study not too long ago, but does anybody know where you find out that Luke is not a Jew?
There are those who are with me. I guess Thessalonians. I can't.
It's not, but you got the right. We will go there because if Burke has forgotten it, then we need to go over it. It's in Colossians chapter 4. Okay?
Colossians?
Yeah, Colossians chapter 4, and I'm just going to have to read this to you so you can see this. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And Jesus, who is called Justice. These are my only fellow workers for the kingdom of God. So you were right. That's it. Okay? who are of the circumcision, meaning they are
Jews.
Jews. They have proved to be a comfort to me. Now, there were a couple others he talked about earlier in verse 7, Tychicus and etc. So he's talking about the Jews. And then he says Epaphras, who is one of you. Okay, so obviously Epaphras is not a Jew. One of you, a bondservant of Christ, greets you, always laboring fervently for you in my prayers, that you may stand perfect and complete in all the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has great zeal for you and those who are in Laodicea and those in Hierapolis. Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you, meaning they are with Paul. They're with Paul. And because he says these are my only fellow workers for the kingdom of God who are of the circumcision, and Luke and Demas are included with Epaphras, it means that they are not of the circumcision. They're not Jews. Okay, so there you go. That's how we know it is indisputable, and yet people will still dispute it. Okay, it's very clear. Luke was not a Jew.
So what was he doing? He was just hanging out with them before Jesus? Or
Luke came in with Paul. He didn't come in at Jesus' time.
Okay.
Yeah, no, he came in with Paul. Yes. So let's see here. Yes, Paul emulated his Lord well in order to bring the word to the world. Even today he is despised by Jews. His words are attacked by world leaders and college professors. And his life and work is even diminished by ill-informed Christians as to the nature of what his writings mean. If you're in the Hebrew roots movement, you've heard Paul maligned many, many times because they say that he's an aberrant, he is not proper in his theology, etc. Because Paul completely destroys, if you read his writings, you have to either say that they're not canon, they don't belong in the Bible because they contradict our theology, or you have to say our theology is wrong. It's wrong. Okay? And most people aren't willing to do that. Once they've got it in their head that they are right, R-I-T-E, then they will never change their minds. Okay? See, I'm never wrong. Okay. That's just making a joke there. R-I-T-E is not right. Okay. He is often ignored by churches, and yet it is his writings which establish proper doctrine for all churches during the Gentile-led church age. People don't want to have Paul, not just because he refutes things like Hebrew roots movement, the Judaizers, etc., because he actually provides proper doctrine for the church age, which does not fit, believe it or not, with things like the Sermon on the Mount, because Jesus wasn't speaking to the church at the time. He was speaking to the Jews about the ideal of what they needed to do in order to be perfect under the law. Okay? And so what Paul says does not fit there. And people love to cite the Sermon on the Mount. As a matter of fact, I think there are some preachers in the Episcopal Church that have never preached a sermon outside of the Beatitudes because it's feel good for them. This is the ideal. This is how we're to live. And yet it has nothing to do. It has something to do with the church. Don't get me wrong. But he is speaking to Israel under the law. It is a tutor of what he is saying. This is the ideal. You will never meet this ideal. We need something different. Hence, Christ said those things, and then he was crucified, okay? He died for the sins of the people, and then the new covenant was issued, okay? Or it came into effect. And so even mainstream, supposedly, denominations will debase Paul. They will not speak of him properly, or they'll say, we don't need to hold to this because, Paul says things like women are not to teach or have authority over men, right? They don't like that in denominations today because they've ordained 14,000 billion different women into positions they're not supposed to be in according to the Bible. All right. And then after the women are ordained, next thing you know, you start ordaining other people that are obviously morally deficient. Next thing you know, you've got a church that is no longer a church. Okay. And this was all relayed to us by Paul, very specifically, especially when he wrote to Timothy. But that's a different issue. We'll keep going on. He's often ignored by churches, and yet it is his writings which establish proper doctrine for all churches during the Gentile-led church age. As Christ's ambassador, rejecting him and his word is thus a rejection of Christ and his word. But in his life, the Lord allowed him to be so bound. He was bound in chains, and it actually worked out effectively for ministering to some people at some times. He always includes that when he writes about those things. The word